Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a writing coach, a manuscript editor, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one to one with me, and I'm one to one with Ron Turker. Ron is a comedian, a surgeon, an author, a novelist, not necessarily in that order, but so let's just get into it. He's the author of the new book, The Wandering Jew of Saint Salacious. So, Ron, welcome to One, and tell us a little bit about the book.
Thanks, John. The book is kind of the culmination of a 30-year career in medicine, and it's basically my love letter to my career in medicine, but it's written with a very sharp pen.
And Saint Salacious. I don't think that there is a Saint Salacious, but I'm sure that there's a reason why you call it that.
Yeah. So basically, the title, the way I kind of chose it, was to bring a little bit of highlight of what's inside the book.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times people will call hospitals by nicknames, the people that work there.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this case, all the characters in the book, uh, they call the hospital Saint Salacious, but the real name is Saint Solange, who's a
Mm-hmm.
real saint, but I've never heard of a hospital named after her.
And Salacious probably has something to do with I don't know, behavior of some of the personnel.
Yeah, so in the book, the main character Marty is always trying to figure out where the name came from, and everybody's kind of circumspect about where the name came from until someone explains to him that it all started in the '70s, back when there were wild key parties and all sorts of crazy things going on inside the walls of the hospital. And the headlines were the Hospital of Saint Salacious, and that name stuck from the '70s in the characters' minds and continued on 50 years later.
Is there a little excerpt that you could read to give us a sense of it?
Sure. Well, I can read the beginning of the book, the intro, which it doesn't really give us the salacious part.
Oh, well, we've got to have something to anticipate.
Yeah, so I can read a little bit of the intro,
Sure.
and this introduces us to Marty.
Okay.
Every chapter starts off with the voice of his late grandfather.
Okay.
And so the story starts out as, even the finest suit lives a life. You can mend and patch, but you never stitch away death. Louis Fisher, Zeta to his grandkids, and a hell of a Brooklyn tailor. May his righteous memory be a blessing. The distance between confidence and catastrophe turned out to be quite small, basically the thickness of an artery wall. Dr. Martin Fisher ignored the blood trickling down his leg and leaned against the operating table to steady his hands. His fingers moved in a synchronized blur, trying to stem the red tide. His muffled voice was stuck in a loop. Jesus, that's a lot of blood. Jesus. Jesus was an interesting expletive for an agnostic Jew and a secular surgeon, but Marty had been put on notice. One more F-bomb in the OR, and he'd be right back in that bullshit sensitivity class. Still, it was hard for him to watch his mouth and his hemorrhaging patient at the same time. Sadie Greenberg's blood pressure and regular heart rate were reassuring for the moment. But all moments pass, and at this rate of blood loss, so would Sadie. He sucked his lower lip against his teeth. Yeah, a lot of blood. The surgery was supposed to be a straightforward hip revision, a simple change of the cracked ceramic acetabulum, the artificial hip cup in her pelvis. The ball and metal stem firmly attached to her femur and in perfect shape could be left in place. But this shattered prototype socket, not even 2 years old, looked exactly like the other two patients who had enrolled in the Novacon study and whose cups had already failed. This shouldn't be happening. Marty glared into the wound. He'd have to halt the study, but that call could wait. Right now, his focus was on Sadie, and her surgical case, had it gone as expected, should have taken a quick 2 hours tops. Her preoperative blood count had been rock stable, so Marty hadn't a clue that disaster lay waiting below the thick fascia, the muscular envelope surrounding her hip.
Okay. Um, I want to get back. I want to go to the cover in a minute, but obviously, writers write what they know, and you know surgery. Have you been in a situation just like the one you wrote about in that very beginning?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are times when things go wrong, they're unanticipated, and yeah, all of a sudden, the blood starts coming, and things change in a literal heartbeat.
And so, were you in a sense working stuff out as you wrote this book?
So you're asking me if this book was a form of therapy, and I'll say absolutely.
Right.
And I thought at the beginning that writing the book would be cheaper than therapy, but after I got done with everything, I'm thinking maybe it's kind of equal.
Okay. Um, let's go back to I mean, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but before I get into all that, I want to go back to the book cover and tell me more about that. How did you come up with it? Was this your concept? How did you come up with the cover?
I was looking for a cover artist for a couple of months, and everybody that I had reached out to was busy, and people that I knew and I trusted, and so I said, well, let me kind of jumpstart the process by mocking one up,
Mhm.
and this way I could give one of the artists, like, this is my thought, this is my idea. He's thrust out of this academic medicine, which he loves, and he loves taking care of. That's Marty. He loves taking care of the indigent people at the university and so forth. And the only job that he can get is at this upscale Catholic hospital. And so this was my mind. This was what was in my mind when I kind of mocked up the cover. You have the hospital front and of the building, and then you can see the design with like an outline or a mock-up of the hospital itself,
Mhm.
with both the red cross, which represents medicine, and then the cross.
Mhm.
And so when I mocked it all up, and then I sent it out to a couple of different book cover artists who I knew, they said both, why would you do anything different? This looks great. Uh, and so this was my artwork, which was not meant to be artwork. It was supposed to be a mock-up originally.
Mhm.
And so I tidied it up, and then this is where I landed. And I hope the cover kind of resonates with people.
I mean, book covers, it's so subjective and you can't please everybody, but the idea is to capture the essence of what's going on in the book. And one of the things that struck me is, how in your face, the Christian iconography is to Marty as he's entering the hospital for the first time. Um, and that, I mean, I'm assuming that your upbringing is Jewish. I'm assuming that you're an agnostic, but you clarify things, please.
Both of those are correct.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I was brought up in a relatively conservative Jewish household on Long Island. I think if my mom had her druthers, I wouldn't have been a doctor, which is strange for a Jewish mom.
That
But
is.
she wanted a rabbi. She already had a couple of doctors, and she was like, "Yeah, I think what we need is a rabbi." And so she worked me pretty hard, and I was not having it. It wasn't my thing. Um, I appreciate the culture. I love the culture. Absolutely love it. But it just, the kind of the religious roots, they never really took hold for me. And but when when I was an adult, and I started to kind of visit churches, and go around and see different things, and I married a Catholic girl, so was spent plenty of time in the church and so forth, and I would look around, and during mass and things like that, and all the iconography, and I'm thinking, yeah, wow, this is just something that I was so out of my element, and yeah, so I kind of pictured that Marty was a guy who was going to be out of his element.
What's it like to be Jewish but living in what is ostensibly, it's more diverse nowadays, but when you were growing up, it was pretty much a Christian society. What's it like to be bombarded with that kind of imagery all the time?
I wasn't really kind of exposed to it very much. So growing up in the town where I grew up, there was a very large Italian population, and there was a large Jewish population, and then there was a kind of a smattering of Irish and so forth. And but it was a pretty, kind of bipolar type thing. And yeah, I had all these friends who were the Catholic kids, um, but really didn't spend much time going to those churches. So when I was an adult and I took off, and when I say adult, really when I was 18, I was out of there. And so I really wasn't an adult, but that was like when I first started to kind of look around and see, wow, things are different in the wider world. Matter of fact, there was a time when one of my brothers I was in medical school, and one of my brothers bought a farm up in upstate New York in a tiny little town. And we were on weekends, I would go and help him to kind of rehab this farm, this 200-year-old farm. And there we were, two Jewish guys up in the middle of upstate New York. I mean, in a tiny, tiny town, and wondering, well, what's it going to be like when we meet the neighbors? Which didn't take long before a woman, kind of an older woman, came, and she had a pie, and she walked up the long driveway, and I go, oh, here it comes. And we had a wonderful time chatting with her. And she asked us, she said, so on behalf of the town, I wanted to invite you all to come to our church on Sundays. And my brother politely said, he goes, well, we don't actually go to church on Sundays. And she said, oh, you're not churchgoers? And he said, no, no, we're Jewish. And she had a blank look on her face like, okay. And she said, but you're still welcome. And he goes, well, thank you very much. And she leaves, and I kind of look at my brother, and I'm like, wow, we kind of dodged a bullet there. And then she knocks on the door again, and we open the door. She peeks her head in, and she says, I do have to admit that I came here a little bit on an information gathering, expedition for the town. And my brother goes, oh, really? And she said, yeah. She goes, well, I don't know about the Jewish thing. She goes, but I'll be happy to report to everybody that thank God you're not Catholic. See, that was eye-opening for us. That was just sort of like, wow, we had no idea.
Oh, love your neighbor,
Yeah.
That's hysterical. Is there I mean, look, I want to talk about writing, but look, as a surgeon, you deal with life and death matters, and have had to face mortality in many ways. So how did you come to being an agnostic?
Wow. I've never actually kind of dissected those two things out before or equated them. Yeah, I always had, even when I was sitting in the pews as a kid, in the synagogue and listening to these prayers and so forth, so the congregation where I grew up, the prayers were mostly in Hebrew. And, we learned them, and you would recite them. And I knew a little bit of Hebrew, but not enough to be very, kind of fluent. And then as I'm sitting there, even as a kid, I'm reading the English translation. I remember like one night I'm sitting there in a Friday night service, and I'm reading the English translation, and I was like, and it was basically this supplication of, oh dear God, please don't hurt us, and please don't pinch us, and like Mel Brooks has said in the 2013-year-old man, it was like this kind of like, I'm in awe of you, and I can't thank you enough, and I grovel at your feet, and please don't step on us, and so forth. And I was like, wow, if we have to, if God is that narcissistic that he needs little old us, these little old ants that he created to kind of tell him how great he is, I'm not sure he's someone that I really kind of connect with. And so I became kind of agnostic then. And one of the things about the Jewish culture is that of questioning is really acceptable and encouraged. And so, I felt comfortable with like, I question that this really happens. And so fast forwarding to my life in medicine, I started as an EMT and then kind of, eventually went to med school and so forth. I never, I guess I was always comfortable with the fact that we're finite, and then there definitely are kind of times where exits are early and premature, and that's horrible and sad. Um, but I just never got comfortable with the idea that there was somebody who was actually watching out over all of this, because there was too much randomness and too much chaos for me to kind of say, yeah, somebody who's really got our best interests at heart is running the show here. Because as far as I could see, the show was kind of a shit show. It just,
So is that maybe one of the reasons you got into comedy? I mean, comedy is irony. So is there a connection there?
maybe, like it was when I was younger, being kind of funny was a bit of a survival tactic. There were
Mhm.
4 boys in my family. I was the youngest, but the youngest by far. So they were all born 2 years apart. And then after the last one, 5 years later, along comes me. And if you're going to survive in a household like that, especially my mom was pretty funny. So if you're going to make it, you better have some chops. And then when I, got older, I knew I knew I could be funny. But kind of used it to my advantage as much as I could, although I never had the guts to get up on stage. Just couldn't take that leap, even though I thought, oh, I think I could do it better than this guy who's standing up to that guy. Until a buddy of mine in med school, without telling me, signed me up for an open mic. And then a week and a half before, he springs it on me. You're signed up. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? I can't do this. I can't do this. He goes, you can do it. And there was just enough of an itch that I sat down with a yellow legal pad and I started to write, and it just came pouring out. And so my first night, I had a 10-minute spot. I did 12 minutes, my very first time on stage, and I killed. I mean, I did great.
Do you
And
remember any of the jokes or how you approached it?
it was med student kind of jokes, and it was crude, and it was pretty primitive, and it was perfect for the 80s. And it was basically kind of like this whole, the really easy kind of offhand, the first time you have to go in and do a pelvic exam, and your kind of notion of this thing is that, there's a line of just beautiful 20-something women that are just lined up, and that's not life, and that's not reality. So it just sort of basically, the concept of how reality comes to the medical student world and so forth. And it was a great set that made me think, oh, this is easy. But it was also like a real high. And that's a problem. That's a real problem for a guy who's kind of mostly a teetotaler. That's a problem. And so the next thing I knew, I was chasing that high, thinking it was going to be easy, and it was anything but.
When you were chasing the high, did you have designs of really, I don't know, making a career out of it, going to Saturday Night Live or, that kind of stuff?
I think fantasies live in all our heads. Sure. Yeah. I mean, um, it was what it was. It was, in the moment, it wasn't like I'm chasing a career. In the moment, I was just chasing the next fix. And sometimes you'd get close, and sometimes you would be you'd have a bad trip, a really bad trip. Um,
Was there then a time when you were self-aware that this is counterproductive, this whole chasing the next high? Was there a moment where you said, whoops, let's turn that around?
I wish I could tell you that I was that self-aware. I think most addicts are not that self-aware. There was one of my one of my mentors, one of my professors in medicine, who did at one point take me aside and say, this might not be the healthiest thing for you. I mean, I was up late at night, night after night. I would be out at the clubs. You finish up at midnight, let's say, but you can't go home because part of getting the next gig is sitting at the bar and schmoozing. And so you got to be there till 1, 2 in the morning. And then I would get up at 5 and get going for the next day. And, that was not necessarily sustainable.
Yeah, yeah, and yet you've done comedy for a long time. How many years would you say you were really regularly doing it?
I was only regularly doing it for, I mean, really regularly doing it for about 2.5 years, where I was, really doing it. And then I graduated from medical school and I went to Chicago to do my internship. And that was in itself a disaster, because I did not match in any of the programs where I wanted to go. And so I ended up just getting kind of shuttled off to Chicago. And it was a pretty brutal program that I was in. I learned a lot, but it was brutal. And at the end of that first year of my internship, I was again at a crossroads where I had to decide what I was going to do. And I reached out to the guy who hired me first, and back in Syracuse, and managed, sending me here and there and so forth. And I reached out to him and I said, I don't know if I want to stay in medicine. I don't know if I want to kind of continue on in comedy. And he, he was an amazing guy. He is an amazing guy. He's still around. But he set me up in Chicago for a couple of showcase nights, at some clubs, at a club. And he came out, and I did a couple of nights. I was kind of rusty at first, and then the second night it was better. And then he sat me down after it was done in the back of the club, and he goes, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Well, I think I did pretty good tonight." And he goes, "Yeah, you did." And he goes, "But what do you think about the career?" And I was like, "Well, I might be interested in, this and the other thing." And he says, and then he goes, "Okay." He goes, "I've been around comics for 20 years at that point." And he said, "It's brutal. It's a brutal life. These guys, the guys who make it, for every guy that makes it big, there's 1,000 guys that are running around in beat up cars all over the United States, going from club to club, and they're just barely making it." He said, "You, if you stick it out in medicine, have a gig that will last you a lifetime." So, like you hear it a million times from managers who don't think the comic has the chops, and they'll say, "Don't give up the day job just yet." But he was saying, this is more than a day job. This is a career.
Right.
And I
Did
appreciated
did
that.
did you ever see the series I'm Dying Up Here?
No, I couldn't bring myself to see. It's sensitive. It's very, still to this day, it's hard for me to watch people flailing because I've been there.
Yeah, yeah, because that was very raw.
Yeah.
And I think it only lasted one season, but very compelling, compelling writing. And so you wrote. When did you get to the point where you thought that you'd actually become a novelist? Because that seems to have come later, or at least getting published came later. But the idea was there, or the desire was there earlier.
The desire was definitely there earlier. Actually, even when I was in medical school, I was writing. And it was comedy at first, but there was other things I was writing as well. And I had started a couple of different novels that never really went anywhere. And I threw one out to a guy who's a writer out in Hollywood, who's a friend of mine. We did comedy together. And I remember, like, that was a good 25, 30 years ago. I sent this thing to him, and he goes, "Needs a lot of work, but there's some good stuff in here." And I was just sort of like, okay, I don't have time for this. At the end of the career, though, so much stuff builds up, so many thoughts, so many kind of, different situations, so many stories. There are thousands of stories, and we all have stories, right? But when you're in those hospital walls, the stories come to you. Everybody comes to you with their story,
Mhm.
whether they want to or not. Most of them don't want to be there, for sure. And so there's all these stories, and they just litter your head. And so either you try to flush them out, or you work them through. And that's what the novel was about.
And how do you access these? Do you plan things out? Do you write seat of the pants? A little of both?
Yeah. I am kind of a seat of the pants writer. I will have a general arc of a story. I'll write that out, general arc. I will um, write down some just chapter thoughts, just some basic thoughts or chapter questions. What happens in this chapter, what gets satisfied, what doesn't. And then I start writing. And usually if I can get 3 chapters in, then I'll stop, sit back, and then start kind of actually arcing it out more carefully. But I need an on-ramp into the story. And so that first 3 chapters is my on-ramp that I can kind of then start seeing something, like take shape and so forth.
And there are a couple of subplots in the Saint Salacious story, and one of them is, big medicine. Um, Talk about that, because you've certainly, you've been, very hands-on, but you come across all kinds of different people with different abilities to pay. What is your take on the medical system, why it's so expensive, what can be done to reform it?
There's a line in the book that says money is gravitational. Um, it's gotten so big that politically and culturally, it's hard to take on a multi-trillion-dollar industry. I'm sure you know that our healthcare system eats up about 18% of our gross domestic product. The next closest country to us is Japan at 11%. And they have the oldest population on the planet. Plus, they're still dealing with the radiation effects from World War II. So they have, a built-in unhealthy part of the population to deal with. So it's expensive. The next countries from there are 8 to 10% of their GDP. And their health statistics and their outcomes are way above ours. So what drives it is, I would say, inertia. The post World War II era, when we as a country were in free fall, the economy was in free fall, and we were trying to cobble things back together. The federal government said we need to have a wage freeze, and just for a couple of years until we kind of figure this out. Well, companies, in order to hire the GIs that they wanted that were coming home, they would offer benefits because they couldn't offer wages. So they would offer healthcare, which back then, what was that, $100, right? It doesn't cost that much to diagnose that someone has cancer and go, sorry. But we have stuck with that system ever since. Whereas other countries that were literally rebuilding their buildings and rebuilding their societies after World War II rebuilt the healthcare system from scratch.
Often with the help of the US government, right? The Marshall
Exactly.
Plan and
Oh,
so on.
100%.
What did we turn the corner in the right direction, do you think, with the Obamacare? I mean, I've heard the criticism that the Affordable Care Act, medicine really isn't affordable. Was that a step in the right direction? Do we need to, reform some more? What do you think?
It was a half step or a quarter step in the right direction. So what happens if you're driving up a hill, right? And you know that your engine, or you're running out of gas, okay? And your engine is sputtering. If you don't clear the crest of the hill, you're only going to slide back. Political forces being what they were in 2008 and 10, they made sure that we never got to the top of the hill. They took out the public option. And so as one of the myriad of issues that they kind of made sure that they hamstrung the whole package. And because of that, we never cleared the top of the hill, and we are indeed just sliding back. And in many ways, the Affordable Care Act kind of set us up for an even more painful failure, I believe. My opinion.
Yeah. So it doesn't sound like you're particularly optimistic about the future.
No, I think that political will being what it is, and having kind of especially a very polarized society right now, which even those words are becoming kind of trite and cliche. But that is such that no, we will not be able to move forward. And I believe in, if we, if we don't kind of make a monumental change, just like climate change, the whole thing is going to collapse. As it is collapsing. I mean, like for the individuals who are working at a job that makes 50, 70, $90,000, but there's 4 people in the family, 5 people in the family. They can't afford out of pockets and deductibles of 5,000, 7,500, 10,000. And yet those are the plans that we are offering to them, where the people that can afford it the most have, $1,000 deductible. And to them, $1,000 is loose change in their pocket. So everything's upside down.
So what does collapse look like?
I think we're kind of seeing the beginnings of it, is that we've never actually voiced that healthcare is a right. We won't give that voice. We won't make that statement. And so we are seeing the results of it on the streets today. We're seeing homeless and houseless people that have no health care. We're seeing the whole opioid crisis, which we were part of. We were a significant part of.
You meaning the doctors?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, we played a very large role in that. And it's, not shocking where we've gotten to. We've kind of wised up and literally kind of put people through this withdrawal, where we said, oh, it was a mistake to give you all the opioids, so we're going to cut everybody off.
Mhm.
Well, that's not how it works. People are going to find that, that drug in order for them to feel like they can survive. So I think that's what we're seeing as the beginning of it. But people are going to just go without any kind of care, to the point where our system looks very much like, like Colombia did 30 years ago. Colombia was, when I first started going down there in the early 90s, if you broke your arm, your family would have to go to some local store and pick up some casting supplies, bring it to the doctor, and they'd put a cast on your arm. If you broke something where you needed a plate and screws or a rod, your family had to go to the black market and buy it. Otherwise, you were not getting care. You'd be home laying in that bed, not getting up, which is a huge drain on the economy and society. Colombia, the place that we're all, we've been afraid of, they now have 95% of their population is covered by some kind of social medical network. 95% in the last 30 years. So they've gone from, almost a very small sliver of insured people to everybody has some kind of insurance. And access is hard, but they're attempting it to do something positive.
Talk a little bit about the Silver Service Children's Foundation that you were one of the founders of back in 1992, and you're still involved with that. Am I right?
I am, yeah. So I was a fellow at the Shriners Hospital in Chicago. We saw we had, usually a handful of Colombian kids that this one woman from a group, like I think from Healing the Children, would bring up every year. We would take care of those kids. We'd operate on them. And it was very costly for that organization to bring those kids up and to house them while they were there for months, getting reconstructive surgery and so forth. And I worked under a young, brand new attending, Peter Smith. And so he and I were in clinic one day seeing patients, and this woman who, was bringing all these kids up, she just kind of offhandedly said, wouldn't it be great if you guys could go down to Colombia and I bet you in a week you could do more cases than you do here in a year, and it would be so much less expensive, and maybe you could teach a little bit and so forth. Wouldn't that be great? Like, just the rhetorical kind of question to throw out. And we're in a busy clinic, and I think Peter said, sure, yeah, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? And that was the end of the conversation for about a month. And then she showed up in clinic with 10 plane tickets in her hand. Remember, the kind of like the actual tickets.
Yeah, right.
And she said, great, we can get this going in the next month or so. And it was more a matter of, we just kind of backed into this whole thing than really kind of like, we didn't have any idea what we were doing.
So what was it like when you got there?
It was kind of overwhelming in a lot of ways. I think the first time there must have been 300 families outside the door of some clinic that we were in, Cali, and it was, overwhelming. But worse than that, we did not have any lay of the land. We didn't know who the doctors were down there, who the surgeons were, and we didn't know they had a pediatric orthopedic surgeon in Cali. And so we stepped right on his toes in his own hospital.
Oh, man. Oh.
Yeah, because his administration kind of, gave us the green light to come down, but we didn't know he existed. So that took a lot of repair effort and a few years for us to finally kind of get to the point where we're all friends now, and we're all colleagues. But yeah, we were learning as we were going, and we made a lot of rookie mistakes.
And so now your volunteer work has gone to Ecuador, Peru. I believe recently were you in Ukraine during the war?
Yeah. So the SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society, that I work with, they reached out, and that was back right at the beginning of the war. And they said, would you be available to do exploration? We have a grant that we want to use for kids. It's a big grant that some donor had given, and we just need to know who the players are. Again, so now we learn. So I learned, you got to find out who the players are and who you can work with and where the needs are. Mm-hmm. So that whole concept of Sam sending me was to do just that. Was a foray to find out who are the actors, which hospitals need these funds, what can we do with this? And then at the same time, we always kind of mule equipment with us. So we brought 200 pounds of equipment, my partner and I, into Ukraine. I got a call. They put me on hold through April, and then they said at the end of April, they said, they called like on a Monday and said, can you be on a plane by Friday? Mm-hmm. And so, I had things packed, I had things kind of ready. And so I was like, okay. But I was supposed to go with my wife the next month to Africa for a different NGO that she works with. And I said, it's going to be a hard stop at the end of 2 weeks, because I got to get down to Africa. And so that's what we did. And we flew into Poland, walked across the border. A driver picked us up and took us into Lviv. And that was the most dangerous part of the trip, was this 20-something driver who really was the Mario Andretti of the Ukrainian West. He was something.
What was it like being there?
It was a little disorienting at first. We weren't sure. I mean, we didn't have any contacts at the hospital, that it was like with no solid contacts. And so we were supposed to meet with this one physician, this one young surgeon, on a Sunday. The hospital was locked. We didn't know kind of what was up and what was down, but we eventually found someone to let us in, and we started kind of making contacts one after the other. But at first, just like I told you before, there was this woman who was the head of the pediatric orthopedics department at this one hospital, and she said, we don't need you, and we don't really want you. And we're like, okay, if you can just kind of point us in the direction of where we can be helpful. And so that was a negotiation in and of itself. And then we met with other surgeons. We kept, we were able to make more and more inroads at different hospitals. And eventually, toward the very last day of our stay, that one surgeon who told us that she didn't need us reached out and said, "Could you come help us with a case?" And I was like, "Okay, so at least we've shaken hands, and she's willing to give us a try."
So do you do any teaching, any at any medical school teaching?
I do. I've always been at various medical schools, and I've always taught. I still do. I still give the occasional lectures, but when I'm still taking call, and when I'm on call, I teach. Sometimes in the clinic, people will send me students. And actually, there's a residency program, a podiatry residency program here in town, and they chose The Wandering Jew of Saint Salacious as their book club book. So I meet with them on Monday mornings.
Excellent. So, are you working? I'm assuming you're working on another book and another and another. Is this going to be a series? What's the future?
I envisioned it as 3 books. I'm working on the prequel where Marty and Ralph, their friendship started in Chicago at a hospital that's no longer there. So that's what I'm working on right now, and then there'll be a sequel later after I get that done.
Now that you've gotten a book out there, what is the reality like compared to the expectation, or is it too soon to tell?
Well, I would say that my expectations were just about nil, because I had no idea what to expect.
Yeah.
So but the book is selling, and people seem genuinely kind in their thoughts about the book. I'm like, wow. So it continues to sell. I noticed that, like when you're actively promoting it, it sells a little bit better. And then when I spend more time working on the second book, or working on other things like, various essays and op-eds, that I notice a little slack in the sales, although it still sells. So it's a balancing act between, like, where am I with, kind of with promoting The Wandering Jew, and where am I with, working on the next book, which I'm beginning to feel a real tug to get into that and really kind of flesh it out.
Was the fact that you had to do a lot of the marketing a kind of a surprise, or did you expect that? And how are you as a marketer?
It was a surprise. It wasn't a surprise because, that everything you read, every conference you go to, they talk about it. It's not a secret. On the other hand, I didn't know what that meant, and I guess I thought I was willing to just sort of throw the book out there, and then if it went somewhere, it went somewhere, and if it didn't, it didn't. And but I find that there's a balance of being willing to kind of promote it. And how am I doing? I think I'm doing reasonably good for a guy who has no idea what he's doing. No idea. I'm having fun with it. How's that? So I figured if I was going to do this, this whole shameless kind of marketing thing and so forth, and put myself out there, I was going to put myself out there in a very genuine fashion. I wasn't going to kind of like, this is the best book you've ever read. If you've ever met a doctor, a Jew, or a Catholic, you are, you're in luck, because this book will teach you everything you need to know. And it's like, no, this book is there's a lot of me in the book, and meaning not necessarily, like kind of the characters, but there's a lot of my, my sensibilities are packed in the book. And so it's not that hard it's stuff I've been saying forever.
What kind of advice do you have for people who have another career and yet they have the itch to write? What are some of the lessons you've learned along the way that you could pass along about writing?
If you really have an itch to write, and I tell this actually to the kids I take care of, like, these kids will come in with all sorts of different kind of, ongoing issues and so forth. And I'll ask them, I'm like, do you like writing at all? And they're, some of the kids will be like, I like the idea of it. And I was like, get a journal. There was one girl who I bought her a journal. I was just sort of like, here, take this, and just put stuff down. And because that's gold later on. What I guess I'm saying is that if you have the itch to write and you're not writing, it'll seep out in kind of less constructive ways.
Do you journal?
I do. Yeah. Not as often as I'd like, but yes, I do. Yeah.
I mean, did you start doing that at a young age?
I got my journal right here.
There you go.
I did not. I would write down comedy bits, like things that I would see. I would jot those down, but I didn't journal from a young age. That came later. And I still have a separate kind of place where I'll jot down the comedy stuff. Just the observations that, like, oh, I could do something with this. Whether I ever do or don't, I don't know.
So people can get in touch with you through your website, ronturker.com.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add? I mean, we could go on and on, I know, and I'm hoping to be able to see you on the circuit as as now that you're got your footing as an author as well as a surgeon. Anything else you want to add?
I would just say, back to what you were talking about with the writing. I'm not an expert on like the writing process like you are. I mean, like, I've taken classes with you, and you have this incredible presence when you're speaking, and you just kind of engage everybody in that room, and because there's authority in what you say, and it just feels good. I don't have that, but what I do have is just the idea that I just promote the idea that writing is something that if you're anybody can write. Anybody can write. If you're just kind of feeling at all the itch, it doesn't have to be an essay. It doesn't have to be a short story. It doesn't have to be an op-ed, but it's healthy. It is very healthy. And, for years I ran a pediatric pain clinic, and I would tell the kids, write it down, because if you're writing it down, it's not stuck inside. And that can be, slow poison if it's stuck inside.
Whew. So well said. Thank you. We've been talking one-to-one with Dr. Ron Turker, also a novelist, the author of The Wandering Jew of Saint Salatius, and soon other things as well. There's somebody did mention something in the comments. Let me just double check to make sure. Oh, they're just happy with the interview. So nobody had any questions because you answered them all so effectively.
Oh, well, luck.
Yeah, I know. Who knew? Ron, it was a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you.